Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Remote Workforce on Microsoft Teams Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, CoreView, provider of a powerful suite of tools that lets you analyze, administer, automate, optimize, secure, and audit your Microsoft 365 environment, and Smarsh, providing a better way to capture, store, and monitor communications in your enterprise, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be moderating this first session of 3 on this information-packed summit. But before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for a link to that recording in an email. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. At the end of the summit, you'll be asked to take a short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors actually read every comment. I'm one of them, so I know it's true. Your opinions will help us greatly to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $300 American Express gift card. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Microsoft Teams and Remote Workforce for 2023 and beyond. For this session, we've called on Microsoft MVP Ben Stejink. Ben is an information technology pro with extensive experience with Microsoft platforms, including Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and Azure. During his busy career, he has consulted with a wide range of organizations, from 5-person shops to global enterprises in fields ranging from government to professional sports. He's a Microsoft certified trainer and a co-host of the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, where he discusses the latest technologies in Microsoft 365 and Azure universes. And he's an IT pro, speaking from an IT pro point of view. Ben is an awesome presenter, and he's one of our favorites. I know you're in for a great session. Take it away, Ben.
All right. Thank you, John, and glad to be back. Glad to be presenting again. Like you said, Azure guy, Microsoft 365 guy. I recently added another certification. I moved my cybersecurity one up from like a associate to a cybersecurity expert. So apparently, according to Microsoft certifications, I'm an expert now. Take it how you will. Everybody has their opinions on those certification tests. But today, Microsoft Teams and Remote Workforce for 2023 and beyond. This one's an interesting one. I did a similar type of one 6 months, a year ago or so, and there's some things that have changed. In the last few months, there's actually an article that we'll talk about that came out like a week ago, talking about this hybrid workforce and Microsoft Teams. Really, we're probably going to focus on 2023. Well, I can speculate about beyond. Remote workforces will definitely continue beyond 2023. What Microsoft does, usually we get a pretty good idea of what they're going to be doing in the next 3 to 6 months. Once you get outside of 6 months, it gets a little fuzzy. Technology changes. Things like ChatGPT come out. And you start seeing some of the roadmaps shift as they get out more than about 6 months with some of the features they come out with. So we'll talk about what's there today, maybe a few things that are coming, some things to watch out for, and some ways that you as an organization can help empower your remote workforce going forward over the next several months, specifically as it relates to Microsoft Teams. So first thing, this is an interesting one. Team statuses. I have been working with team statuses a bunch. Recently, actually, with one of my clients who was doing some Teams calling. And they ported all their phone numbers over to voice, and we spent a lot of time diving into statuses, how that affects phone calls, what different activities that people do cause them to automatically go into different statuses. Statuses syncing between different devices, whether you have Teams on your mobile device, Teams on a desktop, how some of that can affect the status. And I think one of the biggest things I've taken away from Team statuses as they exist today is using it more of guidance. When you talk about a hybrid workforce or remote workforces, and some companies, and this came out when I was working with this client, want to be able to leverage that team status for what exactly is my employee doing? Are they at their desk working? Are they taking more breaks than they should be? Are they in meetings all day long? And at the end of the day, it's not super reliable if you're using it for exactly when someone is working or when someone is at their desk. One, they can go in and change it. They can always go mark them as away or appear offline. They can go put themselves in Do Not Disturb. And with a remote workforce, it's even hard sometimes this is a mindset that's shifted as, are you results focused or are you that they're sitting at their desk? Someone truly could be sitting at their desk, moving their mouse around, showing us available in Teams all day, and watching YouTube videos. Or they could be marked as away because they don't want to be disturbed and they're hard at work. So not necessarily using that team status to be indicative of when an employee is working, how often are they working, how frequently are at their computer. But really the way I use team statuses and the way I think they are best leveraged when you are dealing with this remote workforce is using it for how you should reach out to an employee. If someone's status is available, maybe just make a quick video call. Call them on Teams, and we're going to talk about video calls here in a little bit. If they're in Do Not Disturb, maybe you decide, well, they don't want to be disturbed. They don't want an interruption. Maybe I should communicate with them via email instead because they're hard at work. Realistically, Teams chats notifications shouldn't pop up when they're in Do Not Disturb. You send them a Teams chat. A lot of times it actually sends them an email that says someone's trying to reach you. Send them an email instead. Or if someone is right back, they're away at lunch, maybe you want to wait, maybe that's I'll just send them a message, they'll see it when they get back. But really using it to gauge how you want to communicate with a person, get an idea for what they're using. There are some benefits when it comes to Teams calling, Do Not Disturb in particular, some of the call queues and call routing where statuses come into play. But really the way I use statuses is more, should I bug somebody, should I reach out to them, and how should I communicate with them? Next up, when it comes, is leads right from those statuses, is think about how you should communicate with that hybrid workforce. Should you be sending them an email? Is this something that belongs in a Teams chat? Do you need to set up a meeting for this? Maybe just make a quick call, whether that be a voice or a video call. This is one I struggle to give concrete guidance around. These are the rules for when you should send an email, when you should send a Teams chat, when you should schedule a meeting. But I think this is something that's important within a remote workforce to really set some precedents for an organization in how you want people to use these different things. I have some clients that literally do all of their communications via Teams chat. Very rare to get an email from them. Other clients, they like email. They're rarely in Teams chat. But what is it that works for your organization? I think for me, email, I tend to think of this as more of a long-form communication. While I do still send one-sentence, two-sentence emails. Usually it's something that I'm like, if they get to this in the next 2 days, 3 days, whenever they happen to see the email, it's fine. It's nothing urgent. It's a question I have. They can get to it when they get to it. Or it's a long-form content. It's, hey, here's a whole paragraph. Here's a bunch of thoughts or something I need you to put together, and I want you to be able to sit down and read through it with email. I don't like Teams chats. I don't think Teams chats are great when you start thinking through big paragraphs. I tend to lose them, especially if it's a very chat-heavy organization where you're getting 10, 15, 20 chats. I'll forget about it, especially if it's something long. I see a really long chat and I want to go back, come to it later. Chances are I'll forget about it. Email, I tend to go back and look through it more in the future. Meetings, making a call, I think in particular this one is one that we've maybe lost a little bit when it comes to hybrid workforce. I think of those times when I worked in an office, and the number of times you'd have some good conversations because someone stopped by your desk, those water cooler, hallway type conversations. With a hybrid workforce, you're sitting at home, you're sitting in your office away from everybody. People aren't as quick to just pick up the phone and make a call, especially a video call with this hybrid workforce. I have some people where I'll do that. I'll start typing them a chat, and I'm like, you know what? I just want to talk to them. I want to see their face. There's a lot of good conversation that can happen when you're on a call with somebody, whether it's just voice or whether it's just video, where email chats, they tend to be very task-focused, focused on a particular, just a little more task-focused, task-oriented. Phone calls, you expand beyond maybe those certain topics. So I think there's something to be said, especially for that remote workforce. If you see someone's status is available and you need to reach out to them about something, pick up the phone, make a phone call. It can be a 2-minute, 3-minute phone call. Maybe something else will come out of it that you need to address. But I think, again, really thinking through how you should communicate with this workforce, even setting some guidelines so that as new employees come in, new remote workers come in, they have a sense for how you as an organization communicate with all these different communication tools that are available, especially in that remote work type scenario. Focus time. This has been really big for me over the last few years. Going back to how you communicate, I think people tend to schedule more meetings, is what I've seen. My calendar has filled up with meetings. Maybe it's how my role has changed within a work environment over the last several years. I think some of it is because you don't pick up those phones. You don't have the quick phone calls. You don't lean over to somebody at the desk and ask them a question. You're like, I need to schedule a meeting with them so I can talk to them about this versus just having that conversation right there. As a result, your calendar ends up getting crazy. I struggle sometimes to actually find time to sit down and work uninterrupted without any meetings. I think it's important to really think about when are you going to get work done. I try not to schedule any meetings anymore, Mondays and Fridays. If I can help it, not a single meeting on my calendar those 2 days. So I can just sit and focus on work. I use Viva Insights within Teams to actually schedule some focus time for me every day too. Mondays and Fridays, no meetings at all. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I try to give myself 2 contiguous hours of just focused work time. Maybe it's simply just responding to emails, catching up on stuff, reading blog posts. But I think it's important for those remote workers to have that time where they can just focus on work. Also at home, unrelated to Teams, I lock the door to my office. I don't need kids coming in, spouses coming in, whoever that may be, but setting aside that time to actually get work done. And I know Microsoft does this. I think there's a lot of organizations that do it, but just no meeting days. Set one as a whole company of, you know what, on this particular day, we are not going to schedule meetings with each other. People need to get work done. People are tired of meetings, of video calls, of Teams calls. They want to be able to just sit, turn on some music, get some work done, and not have to worry about it. So I think, again, as an organization with your remote workers, being able to have them have some focus time, give them that freedom to have that focus time throughout their week. But along with that, let people have fun. There are some fun things in Teams. There's some fun things that came out in Teams in the last couple days that are a little debatable, I would say. I'm not sure how I feel about them. But also let people enjoy Teams. Have a water cooler team or a fun team or a fun channel in Teams where people can just go in and shoot the breeze, talk about news they saw, talk about sports, talk about whatever it is they want to. Some of that fun stuff, an area where remote workers can come in and not necessarily muddle up a conversation about a particular project or about work, but just have a fun space to communicate with each other, post funny GIFs, GIFs, however you want to pronounce it, even play a game. I have done this before with some people that work with me. We've gone in and started a meeting. If you haven't seen it, you can actually add a games tab. Some of them are useful. There's this screenshot here I posted, the Icebreaker, where you can go in and do Icebreaker games as a part of a Teams meeting to just have a little bit of fun before you start the meeting. There's Solitaire, there's Minesweeper in there. So if you start a new meeting, go in and click apps, you can add a game to that meeting. Just have a little fun. Go in and play a game of Minesweeper for 2 or 3 minutes before you kick off the meeting. But while we've been talking about focus time and getting work done in Teams, allow people to have a little fun in Teams as well. One that came out recently, and I did not get this into the deck, so I'll post this out. Maybe we can push this out to the chat, is Snapchat filters you can now add to Teams. This is what I'm a little mixed on. This absolutely falls into the fun category. There's pictures in this blog post of someone in the meeting with a chicken on their head or with a monkey draped over their shoulder, cat ears on. I don't know what to think about this. Yes, it adds some fun to it, but at the same time, Teams is a business platform. I don't necessarily want people joining a business meeting with a chicken on their heads. So I think there is a little bit of a mix there. You can go in and disable this Snapchat filters for Teams. Again, if you want to take fun to another level, maybe you leave it on. I did see one question. Richard asked, does Teams have a built-in game section for meeting? It actually does. So if you're in a meeting and you click, it's an app in Teams. So within meetings now, you can add like those meeting tabs or those apps to meetings. There is a games app that you can add to a meeting. I think admins may have blocked this or disabled it, but if you add that games app to a meeting, there's like 4 built-in games that you can actually pick from to tie into your meeting and play together with whoever's on the meeting. If you want to, just spin up a meeting with yourself, go into Teams, do a Meet Now, add the app in there, and you can kind of check it out and play games that way too. But I did not tell you that if you're supposed to be working. But I think it is important to have fun in Teams. Again, remote workforce, they're not necessarily in the office. You're not sitting there telling jokes. Give them a spot where they can have fun. Encourage the camera. This is one for me. And this is another one I would say is a balance of some people are very uncomfortable with a camera. Some people are like, I don't want to have to turn on my camera every day. I'm able to sit at home in my pajamas and be on a Teams meeting. I get that, but you look at how communication is done. Body language, it's tone, it's verbal. So not only do that comment I made earlier about pick up the phone and make a phone call, that's going to get the tone and the verbal versus just typing out a text message. But then add the video and get the body language in there as well. You have background blur now. You have virtual backgrounds. So if you're uncomfortable with the background in your office, you're sitting in your bedroom on a meeting, turn on your camera, let people get the body language and see your face, blur out the background. Yeah, maybe there's a place for not having your camera. Personally, I'm a big fan of having my camera on. I always try to do it. I'll admit I get meetings, the other 8 people don't have their camera on. I'm like, I'm just going to turn mine off if nobody else is going to turn on theirs. There's also times where, given the scenario, I will leave my camera off. But I think helping people to get comfortable with the camera and being on camera can go a long ways towards helping that communication when you do have that remote workforce. We do have avatars now. These are officially out in public preview. This is another one I'm not 100% sold on. I'm not sure I like having the cartoon version of me in a Teams meeting, but I will say it's also better than nothing. I've found in meetings that I've been on, I do prefer talking to an avatar versus a Teams bubble with like 2 letters in it. It just adds a little bit more personality to the meeting, having some of those avatars. So if you're not comfortable with the camera, you don't want to just do a camera and blur your background, maybe you do start playing with these avatars. Go in and add that app, build some avatars, and start using those in some of your meetings. Another one for your remote workflow is invest in equipment. Get them a good webcam. Number of Teams meetings I've been on where, one, maybe people don't turn on the camera because it's at a weird angle. All they have is their laptop camera pointing like up at them from the desk from a weird angle. Get a good camera so they can have a good position, so that they actually do feel comfortable turning on their video because it's not looking in their ear or up their nose from the desk or something like that. Audio, good headsets. I have different headsets, different speaker phones. Some of the hardware pucks are great for speaker phones. Sometimes I would even say a physical phone or a Teams device. I have some people that are like, no, we're just going to use Teams with a headset. I love having a physical Teams phone dedicated to Teams calling. I have some dedicated Teams devices in my office where I can reboot my computer. If my computer crashes, I don't worry about it. I'm actually dialed into this phone call on one of those dedicated Teams devices right now. So realistically, my computer could go down. I'd still be able to be on the phone. I think physical phones, as long as people don't mind having physical phones or another Teams device in their desk, I think they're great for phone calls. Don't be afraid to invest in those. A Stream Deck, these are kind of fun. Came out for streamers. I've had one for a while. Within the last couple months now, it was released, then it went away, then it was re-released. They added a Teams plugin for your Stream Deck. So now instead of always hunting for my Teams window on my computer when I am using my computer for a phone call, I have physical buttons where I can send reactions in Teams. I can toggle my camera on and off. I can mute it. A Stream Deck is great, especially if you just get one of the smaller ones. I can't remember the smallest ones, like 9 buttons, 12 buttons. They might even have a 6-button one, where you can put those Teams controls and have them handy just right at the touch of a button to control that Teams meeting experience. So investing in hardware can go a long ways as well to really giving those remote workers a comfortable way, a good way to join a meeting and have a quality meeting while they're remote. Training is another big one. Don't forget to train people on how to use Teams. Don't assume that everybody that comes into your organization is comfortable with using Teams or knows all the intricacies of Teams. Maybe they've used Zoom for a long time. Maybe they've used WebEx, some of those other ones. Maybe they really haven't had training before. They were thrown into a company and said, use Teams, but really never taught how to use it. Really learn the features of Teams and make sure everybody in your organization also learns how to use Teams. The difference between screen sharing and application sharing in Teams. The PowerPoint live sharing in Teams, actually going into share, instead of sharing a screen that PowerPoint is in presenter mode on, using the live PowerPoint sharing feature of Teams really improves the meeting experience. If you're doing that and you have links in your PowerPoint, those links are now clickable. So you're not having to send links in chat or do something like that. As people are watching your presentation, they can actually click on the link from the PowerPoint you're sharing. You have some additional controls when you do things like the application sharing, so people can flip ahead in the deck if they want to, or you can lock everybody into only seeing the slide that you're on. So some of that screen sharing versus application sharing, the various Teams controls, where are mute, how do you add filters, how do you blur your background, how can you do things like use the space bar to do like a toggle of the mute, a quick unmute, and then you let go and it remutes. So some of those different Teams controls, how they can work with videos, how they can use their avatars, selecting the right audio equipment, just all those different aspects of Teams. Teams has gotten to be a large product over the last few years. Microsoft continues to invest more and more into Teams. As such, continue to train your employees and train those users on how to use Teams so that they're not sitting here struggling and feeling lost. As these remote employees, they don't know who to ask, they don't know where to go. Schedule some monthly Teams training so you just get on and play with new features in Teams, learn more about Teams. At the end of the day, make sure that your users understand how to use that tool. Diving into some more security stuff, security in the appliance. I think I saw a question go by about some of the security. I think it was maybe CMMC in a Teams with a remote workforce. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at or diving into some of the security and compliance stuff, because this is a big deal with the remote workforce. You don't always know what users are connecting from, where they're connecting from, what devices they're using to connect to your environment. So this is Teams, but this is also Microsoft 365 as a whole when it comes to security and compliance. Because at the end of the day, Teams is a wrapper for a lot of products. You think about calling in Teams. Truth be told, it's still using some of the Skype for Business stuff in the background of Teams calling. Chat functionality, some of your chat history and conversations, calendars in Teams. They're still using Exchange for calendars, for shared mailboxes, for storing some of that chat history. Files in Teams, by default, add in things like, it's using SharePoint by default, but you can go in and actually configure it to use Box or to use Dropbox or Google Drive, some of those other things. So when it comes to security and compliance in Teams, you really have to think about it from that Microsoft 365 level as a whole. One of the big things that you're going to want to think about when it comes to Microsoft 365 and that remote workforce is data loss prevention. What are you doing to make sure sensitive information stays secure? Whether this is PII, HIPAA, financial information, Azure secrets, connection strings for SQL databases, any of that information that you as a company are like, this should not be getting out. We shouldn't be sharing this with external users. Thinking through, what are these data loss prevention policies? What do I have in place? This is all within the Compliance Center in Microsoft 365, setting up some of the information protection. There are a lot of sensitive information types already there, already defined that you can use. The ones I mentioned before, Azure connection strings, Azure storage, keys are a defined sensitive information type. All the PII, financial stuff for various countries is all in there. So you can go in and configure Microsoft 365 to say, if someone goes in and tries to email some information that's classified as HIPAA, social security number, medical information, we're actually going to block Exchange from sending that to external people. Or if someone tries to share a file from SharePoint that contains sensitive information, we're going to prevent them from sharing that information from within Microsoft 365. There's DLP for endpoints now. So you can take that sensitive information and say, you know what, if somebody takes some of the sensitive information, it doesn't just try to email it or share it with Teams, but they actually go in and try to transfer this over Bluetooth or copy it to an external drive. This particular sensitive information, we are not going to allow them to take it to an external device via their endpoint. You can also do, I had something else I was just going to mention, and it completely escaped me. Sensitive information, DLP devices, it's gone. Sensitive information types for Teams meetings. This is one of the newer Teams premium features that has come recently, is you can now use these sensitive information policies, the information protection on here, to apply sensitivity labels to meetings that you have in Teams. Is this particular meeting contain confidential information? We want to actually watermark the meeting recording for this particular meeting because it's classified with a sensitive or a confidential information type. Maybe certain meetings you want to block chat. You can use sensitive information types, sensitivity labels to limit people's ability to chat in a meeting that's labeled a particular way. So this information protection, this data loss prevention, sensitive information is starting to move from where prior it was just email and files to now it's Teams. There's a lot of content generated in Teams from that particular perspective and making sure that that information stays secure. Conditional access is another one of those. Being able to go in and set rules around what devices people can use to connect to your Microsoft 365 environment. You can leverage device filters in conditional access to say only devices from a particular manufacturer. If you have all your device IDs, only devices with these specific IDs. Devices that are joined to our Azure Active Directory environment. There's a lot of different rules you can go put in place to prevent users from using any unapproved device to connect to not just Teams, but to Microsoft 365 as a whole, so that you know that employee 5 isn't going to go to a store, go over to a friend's house and log into your environment, access your confidential information from some random computer at somebody else's house. Going in and setting information or risk policies based on how a particular user might be classified in terms of a risky login or some risky behavior, making them reset their password, or forcing an MFA prompt when somebody tries to access your environment and something about it looks suspicious. I did see the CMMC question pop up. I think that's a good one just because it's tying it back to a particular regulation. I cannot speak to everything you would have to go in to do in order to make your hybrid workforce and all your devices CMMC compliant with Office 365 on this call. There's just not time to do it, but I do know, looking at regulations for CMMC, or if you're talking about SOC 2 Type 2, HIPAA compliant, combining these security and compliance features, data loss prevention, conditional access, information protection, making sure all your devices are joined to Azure Active Directory. You can use configuration policies in Azure Active Directory to push out ADMX templates in certain configuration settings to all of your end user devices, so that, one, use conditional access. If they're not joined to Azure Active Directory, they're not allowed to access anything in your environment. When they are joined to Azure Active Directory, you're going to go ahead and push down all these configuration policies to those devices to make sure that things like passwords are enforced, locking a computer after a certain amount of time. And Microsoft is continuing to invest in this. This is something else you're going to see, again, going in that 2023 and beyond timeframe. They just announced, I'm trying to think, I think it was middle of last week, that they are now supporting the importing of custom ADMX templates now into Microsoft Intune, used to be endpoint management, where you manage your endpoints within Microsoft 365. So you can take ADMX templates for some specific examples they gave were Google Chrome, Adobe, trying to think, there was one other one that they gave in their example, but being able to take those custom ADMX templates for different applications you use, import them into Intune, use your configuration policies to push down those configurations to those devices to make sure that you do stay compliant. Again, we could probably spend an entire hour just talking about this. Application management on mobile devices. There was another new feature that came out in the last couple of months around enforcing the VPN connection from a mobile device to Microsoft 365 when you're accessing data in a business app on your mobile device that's sitting in Microsoft 365. So that the only way that you need to, or the only way you can access that data is if you're connected to VPN, leveraging the company portal, endpoint protection on these mobile devices. So lots of different things like that, particularly in endpoint management / Intune and Azure Active Directory, when it comes to managing the security and compliance, and making sure that you can actually achieve some of those regulated industries or adhere to some of those certain regulations based on your industry when you start talking about a remote workforce. And kind of along with that, this ties into a little bit, is centralize all these things. Give all these users one place to go in Microsoft Teams to access as much as they can. Tie in different third parties with Azure Active Directory for your login, for single sign-in. That's going to help with some of the security and compliance we just talked about. Put some of your third-party apps within Microsoft Teams, because the more you integrate them too, the less people have to try to remember where to go. They're out searching lists. Like, I pop open Teams, I can get all my work done in Microsoft Teams. With what I need to do, everything is secured by using Azure Active Directory for my authentication. All that. And then finally, and then we'll jump into some questions, I've seen some more questions come through, is keep up to date on what's going on in Teams and make sure you help your users as an admin Maybe it's the help desk. Maybe it's just someone that uses Teams and really likes it and wants to share their knowledge with others. To not only you keep up to date, but make sure you're keeping the users up to date with things that are changing in Teams. Whether it's something as simple as chats flipping in a channel where instead of new messages at the bottom, new messages are up at the top. The new Teams client that came out within the last couple weeks as well, making sure users are up to date with that. Here's the link to the Microsoft 365 roadmap. If you go look at it today or 5 days ago when I made this slide, there were 96 different features and Teams that are currently in development and an additional 53 features that are in the process of rolling out. Not saying all of these are going to apply to you. They're not all going to apply to your end users. Some are relatively small changes. Some are larger changes. But there's 150 different things that are actively being changed within Microsoft Teams right now. So you keeping up to date to know what's coming and keeping your users, those remote users up to date, having those monthly, let's learn about Teams, let's learn about the new features in Teams, so that they're comfortable with it as they roll out is going to be super important. So I think I did pretty good this time, John. I actually left just like 10 minutes for questions.
You did. We did have a bunch of them coming in. I just want to remind attendees that you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Kind of hard to know where to start here. How about this one that just came in from Bhavesh, who's wondering how many instances of deep integration have you seen with Microsoft Teams in enterprise companies?
I'm trying to define deep integration in my head. I'm assuming you're talking about maybe deep integration with third parties versus deep integration with within the environment. Either way, I have seen it happen quite a bit. I don't want to use Microsoft as an example. They're an exception to this. Microsoft, obviously, a ton of integration with Teams. But I do have one particular client. They're probably borderline enterprise. I would say they're like borderline SMB enterprise. They're 700-800 employees. They are 100% Microsoft 365 cloud. Teams voice, Teams calling, not a single on-premises server, integrate all their applications into Azure Active Directory for single sign-on. It does happen. I will say when you start getting into big enterprise, some of my clients that are more like the 6, 7, 8,000 employee companies, they still can achieve a lot. I think about some of the applications that I see integrated all the time. Salesforce is one. You can integrate it with Azure Active Directory. Some of the HR systems for provisioning new users, you can integrate into Azure Active Directory for creating those users, getting them into Teams. I think that deep integration within enterprises is achievable. I will say it's a little bit more work. They tend to have on-premises Active Directory servers, primarily because they do tend to have a bigger on-premises footprint, either because they're a little bit older company, they still have legacy applications that have to run on servers that are integrated into Active Directory. They're still doing a lot with pushing out GPOs. So at certain levels, I would say it's a little bit more work. I don't know, aside from like legacy applications and strict dependence on Active Directory, that I've ever come into a scenario where it's been one where if they were willing to put the work in and invest the money in the licenses, because sometimes you do have to start getting into those E5 licenses and some of those add-ons to get some of those features they would need, then I'm like, you know what? You just can't do Teams. I feel like you can get there. I'm going to say it's not always going to be easy or cheap to get to that point, and it might be a longer process. But there are companies that definitely enterprise level, very deeply integrated, all cloud. I have friends, I know people at Microsoft, and I know there are companies that are invested very heavily and deeply into the whole cloud ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So you talked about sort of tons of new features and everything, in the pipeline pretty much all the time. But Sean is wondering, do you know when the background ad button will be added in for Teams within Azure Virtual Desktop?
Unfortunately, I do not. That would definitely be one that would be nice to see. I have seen improvements in terms of being able to better integrate multimedia with Azure Virtual Desktop. And I think that's where some of those types of features do lag behind on Azure Virtual Desktop. It can take a little bit more compute to do some of the background stuff. Obviously, taking like your video and a background video and merging them together and streaming that up through a Teams meeting, it does lag sometimes. I don't have any time frame that I have seen around Azure Virtual Desktop and adding that background in to a Teams meeting.
Gotcha. So Maurice has a very specific security question. Are you familiar with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification from the DoD? His question is, how does Teams in a remote environment survive, I guess, a demand for CMMC compliance?
A lot of configuration. It's a lot of the stuff we talked about on that security and compliance slide. Again, absolutely achievable. I am 99% sure. I'd have to go look. But I have worked with clients that have had to achieve that certain level of compliance before. And I do know it can be done with Microsoft 365. But it does take some work. There are some things that we ran into when we were trying to see how we could get this particular client's environment CMMC compliant around multi-factor authentication in Windows and some limitations there. Essentially, what we found is unless you have something like Windows Hello or a fingerprint scanner or something like that built right into the laptop, it's really hard to achieve CMMC compliance with like physical devices. Because if you use like a USB Windows Hello camera or a fingerprint reader, there were some weird scenarios where like if you did the right sequence of events, you could get around some of the MFA stuff for logging into Windows specifically. So again, there's a whole combination of making sure you have devices with the right functionality and the right hardware built into them, making sure you set up all your conditional access policies properly, making sure all your devices are joined, you have the right licenses. But it is absolutely achievable. It's a little bit of a tangent. This is one misnomer I've seen about Microsoft 365. Microsoft says it's HIPAA compliant, it's SOC compliant, it's CMMC compliant, it's all of these. What that means is you have the ability and the tools are in there to make sure your environment meets all of those requirements. It doesn't mean that you can just go buy a tenant and turn it on and you're automatically going to adhere to all those compliance regulations. You've got work to do on your end to go in and make sure that you go down the list of requirements. I know a lot of those too are like best effort. You need to do your best effort to make sure all this is secure. Here's some requirements. You can achieve it. It takes some work.
So Ramona has a fascinating sort of an etiquette question. What about still images of yourself versus an avatar or live video?
And still, for me, I would say still images are better than no images at all. Personally, I still like talking to a video or an avatar. Again, going more off of the social cues, the body language, that type of thing. And maybe I should do this, John. I need to start turning on my video when I do these. And all of you would actually see how much, even though I'm talking to a gray screen right now, how much I move around and talk with my hands when I'm doing these, even though nobody's in front of me. And I think that's where the video for me is the best, because you see all of that.
Yeah.
Avatars, if they get to the point where they would actually replicate your body language and your movements, I think those would come in a close second. When if you smile, or if you move your hands, or if you look away, if the avatars are replicating your movements. But even avatars right now, the calls I've been on with avatars, people have the ability to like push buttons to make their avatar do all kinds of different things. You're still getting some of that. It feels like a more human interaction, even though it's through a cartoon avatar. Again, pictures probably better than gray squares. To me, it doesn't make a big difference when it comes to picture versus non-picture. It's more still versus video with motion.
Gotcha. I think we have time for one more question here. This one is from Hannah, and it's kind of appropriate. Is there anything Teams has in place that can help with burnout and unplugging?
Some of the Viva stuff is pretty good for this. Again, I go back to some of what I said with just scheduling focus time in Viva, so you're not always feeling like you're in meetings, you're always talking to people, having some downtime. They've done some things with Viva Insights. I wasn't sure about these. Personally, I haven't tried them, but they have things like a virtual commute, where one of these weeks I should go just turn it in and try it and see how it works for me. Because I very much, like, I'll work right up until the kids come running in my office and say, Dad, it's dinner time. And I come down, and if I was having a rough day, like, I didn't have that time to kind of decompress before I transitioned from work time to family time. And I know some people need that. They just need like 30 minutes at the end of their day just to sit, to listen to music, to simulate, you know what, I have a drive home. I need to transition from work mode, the stress that's going on at work, to family time. Setting some of the work hours too in Teams can be good. Like, set work hours, set notifications so that once you hit a certain time of the day, you're not going to get notifications in Teams that people are chatting with you. You're not going to get chat messages. I would love to see them build even more stuff into Microsoft 365 where, without getting a third party, I could say, like, email. Somebody emails me after 5:30, don't deliver it until 8 o'clock the next day. And maybe you have a rule, an emergency, someone can get through. Or maybe just say, you know, if there's an emergency, call my cell phone, but I don't want email notifications, chat notifications, any notifications from Microsoft 365 outside of working hours. Again, it's partway there. It's not all the way there. But absolutely, some of the Viva stuff, I think they have some yoga stuff built in to take some time to meditate, do yoga, whatever you need to do to kind of relax during your day. But there are some things in Viva Insights that can help with that.
Fascinating. This was another great session, but it looks like that's all the time we have for questions right now. We're on the clock here. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Top Microsoft Teams Remote Workforce Best Practices. led by scientist, author, and 21-time Microsoft MVP Brian Posey, and moderated by 1105 Media site producer Chris Paoli. Many, many thanks to Ben Stedging for a fascinating, info-rich session, and to our sponsors, CoreView and Smarsh, for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. And remember, during our next session, we will be giving away a $300 American Express gift card to one lucky attendee. We're going right for the cash with this one. You must be present to win, so stay tuned. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsors, CoreView and Smarsh, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Remote Workforce and Microsoft Teams Summit, called Top Microsoft Teams Remote Workforce Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, 21-time Microsoft MVP, freelance tech author, and commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout Brian's career, he has written or contributed to dozens of IT books, created numerous full-length video training courses, and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of these blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, both available on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. And yeah, with regard to the space stuff, all kinds of exciting developments. Next week, I'm going to be down in Florida doing a simulated moon mission, trying out a new generation of suits that are built for the moon, walking around on a simulated lunar surface, taking geologic samples. Exciting stuff. I'm really looking forward to it. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. You know, for most organizations, Microsoft Teams is an indispensable application, and for good reason. It was one of the main things that got organizations through the pandemic when everyone was working remotely. And of course, today, organizations still have remote users and hybrid users who work off-site part of the time and on-site part of the time. And of course, some people still opt to come into the office. So this poses quite a challenge for Teams admins because they have to juggle those users who are working on site versus those users who work remotely and the users who do both. So what I want to do throughout this presentation is talk about some strategies that you can use for making the experience better all around. For the first portion of the presentation, what I'm really going to be talking about is some structural strategies, some things that you might be able to do to rearrange Teams a bit structurally in order to provide everyone with a better experience based on best practices from Microsoft. And then later on in the presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus specifically on remote and hybrid users. I'm going to talk about some of the things that you can do when remote users aren't having such a good experience. Maybe they're having some performance problems, and some ways of helping to keep remote users engaged. And then toward the very end, I'm going to be talking about some new things that are coming to Teams. And I'm even going to talk about a long-defunct Microsoft product that you would probably never, ever, ever in a million years expect me to mention in this presentation, but it is somehow oddly relevant. So be looking forward to that. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to talk about some structural elements related to Teams at the beginning of this presentation. And the most basic structural element, and I'm sure that most of you probably already know this, but I want to go ahead and mention it for anybody who may be new to Teams. The most basic structural elements are those of teams and channels. So think of a team as a high-level container and a channel as subcontainers within a team. So you can create teams and then you create multiple channels within each team. So one of the first things that you really need to start thinking about with regard to making the Teams experience better for everyone is how are you going to model your team and channel architecture? Typically, you don't want to just go in and start creating teams at random because that can quickly become unwieldy and difficult to manage. So it's better to have some sort of plan as to what justifies the creation of a team and what types of content should really just be added to a channel within a team. So that's something that Microsoft stresses very heavily on their website with regard to Teams best practices. And incidentally, before I get too far into this, one of the major best practices that Microsoft stresses is that it's a really good idea to make sure that anytime that you create a team, that there are multiple owners designated for that team. And the reason for that is really simple. In most organizations, there's a significant amount of turnover. You have new employees starting, you have other employees that may decide to move on and go elsewhere for various reasons. And so if you've got a really large team and you've only got one person who owns that, and that one person happens to leave the organization, well, then you may find yourself in a situation where you can no longer manage that team. So to keep that from happening, Microsoft recommends that anytime that you create a team, no matter what that team is for, that you have at least two owners and preferably a few more for that team, just so that you don't accidentally get locked out. So when it comes to creating a team, think about what your goal is for that team and how that team fits into the organizational structure as a whole. Now, there is no right or wrong way to do this. One of the things that Microsoft hints at pretty strongly in a lot of their documentation is taking a departmental approach to teams. The idea being that you want to have relatively few teams and focus primarily on creating channels within those teams. The main reason being that when you create a team, what's happening behind the scenes is you're creating an active, or not an Active Directory, but rather an Azure Active Directory group. So if you create a huge number of teams, you're creating a huge number of groups behind the scenes, and that can become messy on the back end and difficult to manage. On the other hand, unless you're working in a really small organization, you typically don't want to just create one team and that's good enough for everybody, because that can become difficult to manage for other reasons. Trying to keep up with all of the different channels that you're going to need within that team can be problematic for any number of reasons. So it's a good idea to think about what types of teams you're going to need and then what kinds of channels will best serve your organization within those teams. And there are a million different strategies for this. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong approach that works for absolutely every organization. But what I was going to say a moment ago, and I kind of got a little bit sidetracked, is that one of the things that Microsoft stresses in their documentation is that for a lot of organizations, the best approach is to mirror the team structure based on the organization's departments. So, for example, you might create a team for the finance department and the marketing department, the IT department, and whatever other departments you have. And then once those teams are in place, then you can let the individual departments create channels within those teams on an as-needed basis. So when it comes to channels, typically you would want each department, assuming that you take the departmental approach to team creation, you would want each department to create the channels that makes the most sense for that department, because let's face it, every department is going to have different needs. But you are going to want to have some governing principles in place. The most important is probably to use descriptive names with regard to channel creation, because otherwise you can end up with a whole lot of channels and it can become really difficult to figure out what a channel is being used for and whether or not that channel is still in use. So it's a really good idea to be as descriptive as you can, and I'll show you an example of that a little bit later on. So what are channels typically used for? Well, generally you're going to want to use a separate channel anytime that you're dealing with a separate subject. So for example, if you've got a department that's creating channels, they might create a separate channel for each project that they're working on, or they might create a separate channel for each customer's account, assuming that you're dealing with a fairly small number of customers and each one has a lot of documents and communications associated with them. But generally you would want to think of a channel as being a topic of conversation, and you would want to create a separate channel for each one. Now, when it comes to channel creation, not all channels are created equally. There are actually 4 different types of channels that you can create within Microsoft Teams. There are 3 listed on this slide, and then there's a 4th that I'll talk about on the next slide. So the way that you would typically go about creating a channel is you would go into Teams, you would click the option to create a channel, and when you do that, you're going to end up seeing a pop-up similar to the one that's shown on the right side of the screen. So this is the Add a Channel pop-up. As you can see, the first thing that you have to do is to provide a name for that channel that you're creating, and once again, I would recommend using as descriptive of a name as you can. And there's a description box just below the name field. And I would strongly recommend that even if you are using a descriptive name, take the opportunity in that description box to elaborate and provide as much detail as you possibly can about what that channel actually exists for. because any work that you put in up front with regard to being descriptive with channel naming will only pay off in the long run. So once you've added a name and a description, next you're asked to choose the type of channel that you want to create. And as you can see on the screen, there are three different choices. You can create a standard channel, a private channel, or a shared channel. So a standard channel is what you'll probably want to create most of the time. It basically just means that anybody who's a team member can access the contents within that channel. And there are limits to each of these. I believe the limit, and I'm not positive on the number, but I believe the limit is that you can create up to 199 standard channels per team. The next type of channel that you can create is what's known as a private channel. And a private channel is almost like having a sub-team within a team. The idea being that only people who you designate are allowed to see the communications within that particular private channel. So what's an example of how you might use something like this? Suppose that you've taken the departmental approach to team creation and you've created a team for each department. And one of those departments happens to be your organization's finance department. And you've got one particular group within that finance department that discusses some really sensitive information related to your organization's finances. And maybe that information is so sensitive that the finance department as a whole shouldn't necessarily see all of that. Well, in a situation like that, you might create a private channel that it's just for the people that are discussing that really sensitive information. And then the third option on the screen is to create a shared channel. And a shared channel is typically only used when you need to collaborate with people who are outside of the team. So those are the three main types of channels that you can create. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is a fourth channel type that you can use. And that fourth channel type is the general channel. Now, the general channel, you'll notice, was absent from the screen that I showed you a moment ago. And the reason for that is that it's created by default when you create the team. And the general channel is one of those things that's more or less etched in stone. Once it's been created by teams, you can't delete it, you can't rename it, it's just there. And it exists for as long as the team exists. So organizations use the general channel for different reasons. If you've got a really small team and there isn't really a need to create a million channels within that team, well then in a situation like that, you might just use the general channel to store all of the team's contents rather than breaking that content out into separate channels. In larger organizations or in larger teams, oftentimes the general channel is used to provide information about the team itself. For example, there might be onboarding information stored in the general channel, or there might be information related to announcements that are relevant to members of the team. There are any number of different things that you can store in the general channel. Let me take a step back for 1 second. One thing that I forgot to mention on one of the previous slides, when I had talked about the different types of channels, and I mentioned that there is a limit to the number of channels that you can create, I mentioned that for the standard channel that the limit is right around 199 standard channels per team. When it comes to private channels, the number is quite a bit lower. Again, I'm not positive on the number because I didn't take the time to look this up beforehand. It was kind of one of those things I thought about on the spur of the moment. But I believe the limit is 30 private channels per team. So just wanted to quickly mention that whereas you can create a relatively large number of standard channels per team, the number of private channels that you can create is a lot smaller. Now, one of the things that organizations will sometimes do with regard to a general channel, particularly in a large team, is to create a wiki that goes along with that channel. So this wiki is basically a knowledge base of information related to the team. So if you take a look at the slide, you can see a team, and I've got the general channel open. And you'll notice on the set of tabs up at the very top of the screen capture, there's post, files, and then wiki. And the wiki section right now is empty. You can see an untitled page with an untitled section. But you have this interface that's somewhat like OneNote, and you can go in and begin creating pages and sections. And you can do that to provide team members with information about all of the resources that exist within the team. Now, do you have to do this? No, absolutely not. But in some organizations where you have new people coming into a team all the time and nobody has time to sit down and explain the way that the team is laid out, having a wiki can be very helpful so long as it's kept up to date. Now, obviously, there is some work that's going to be involved in creating all of the wiki content, So this isn't something that you would probably want to create for just any team out there. But if you do have a team that is constantly getting new members and that contains a really complex set of content, then creating a wiki can be a great way of helping your users to become familiar with the contents of that team so that they're able to better function within that team. So another thing that you can do in a large organization is to use templates for team creation. Now, templates are another one of those things that can be extremely helpful, but they're not necessarily going to be the best option for every organization. So let me explain. When you create a template, what you're really doing is you're creating a set of channels and a collection of applications that will be added to any new team that's created from that template. So essentially what that template is doing is it's making sure that a team is created in a standard way with all of the channels and the apps already in place. So it saves you quite a bit of work on the back end. Now, when I said that this is something that isn't necessarily suitable for every organization, there are a couple of reasons for that. The main reason is that let's say that you've got an organization that follows the departmental approach to team creation that I described earlier, whereas there's a separate team for each department. And early on, you create all of the teams that correspond to those departments, and the organization is relatively static in that you're not constantly adding new departments or anything like that. Well, assuming that that's the case, you're probably not creating a lot of new teams. And if that's the case, then there's very little reason to create a template, because why create a template if there's no need to create new teams? Another reason why you might not want to create a template is because not every organization takes a uniform approach to team creation. Let's say that a team does need to be created. In some organizations, there's no rule that says that that team has to mimic every other team that's already been created throughout the history of the organization. The team owner may have very specific needs, and a template may just not meet those needs. So you have to do what's going to be right for your organization. But if you do have a larger organization and teams are frequently being created, and you want those teams created in a uniform manner, then creating a template is going to be your best bet, because it will simplify the team creation process and it will ensure that uniformity that you're looking for. And the really cool thing about this is that Microsoft even provides you with some templates that are pre-created that are geared for specific purposes. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so right here I'm in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, and you can see on the left side of the screen that I've selected the Teams Templates tab. So when I select the Team Templates tab, what you get is a list of the templates that are built into Microsoft Teams. And these are the ones that I mentioned a moment ago that Microsoft has already gone in and pre-created for specific use cases. So I know that the print is probably really small on most of your screens, so I'll just go ahead and read through some of the templates that exist on here. There's Manage a Project, Manage an Event, Onboard Employees, Adopt Office 365, Organize Help Desk, Incident Response, Crisis Communication, Manage a Store, Bank Branch, Patient Care, and there are quite a few others if you were to scroll down a little bit further. The point is that Microsoft has created a really diverse collection of templates that you can use to create teams automatically to meet the particular use case that's associated with the template. Now, there's no rule that says that you have to use one of these template types. You can create a custom template, and my guess is that's what most organizations would probably end up doing. And the way that you would create a custom template is to choose the Create a Template option. And the first couple of screens don't really ask you to do much. Basically, it involves entering a name for the template that you're creating and providing a description. But the screen that you see right here on the slide is really the main portion of the process. And this is where you set up the channels that you want to use with the template, and you define the apps that should be associated with the template. Now, one thing that I will quickly mention is that all of those templates that I showed you on the previous screen do have their use, even if you follow a different type of Teams architecture. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say for a moment that you've taken the approach that I've mentioned quite a few times already in this presentation, and your organization has set up a separate team for each department, and that's the structure that you use. Well, there's no reason, even in a situation like that, why you couldn't use one of the pre-existing templates to create a team for a special use case. So, for example, maybe you have departmental level teams, but you also want to create an incident response team to go along with all of those. That's something that you could use a template for. So just wanted to quickly mention that. Now, something else that I recommend taking the time to do with regard to team management is to take a look at the apps that are available and decide what apps you want to make available to the users within the teams in your organization, and then block everything else. Because otherwise what you can end up with is members of one team will use one collection of apps, members of another team will use a different collection of apps, and it can quickly become very difficult to support. And also, if you have a user who moves from one team to another, it can result in quite a learning curve if they're suddenly being forced to adopt a completely different set of apps than what they're used to. So my recommendation, at least from a management standpoint and from a licensing standpoint, is to try to be consistent wherever you can with regard to app usage. And of course, you can add those apps directly to a team once you've created it. If you look in the upper left corner of the screen capture, you can see that I'm still in the General tab, and this is the same screen that you saw earlier. I've just got the Find an App pop-up showing. So if you go just to the right of Wiki and you click the plus icon, it will bring up the screen right here, and that gives you the ability to search for an app that you want to add to the team. And you can make that available to your, the app that you would add to the channel, and you can make that available to your users right there. So I've spent quite a bit of time already talking about team structure and some strategies for organizing teams and channels and that sort of thing, but there's a whole lot more to teams management than just team and channel structures. Particularly with regard to remote and hybrid users, you have to consider performance and you have to consider end user engagement. So those are the types of things that I want to discuss through the remainder of this presentation. So let's take a few minutes and talk about performance. When it comes to ensuring that users receive good performance, it can be tricky even in the best of situations. But when you have users who are working off-site, troubleshooting performance issues can become a lot more difficult simply because of the number of variables involved. I mean, consider a user who's working at home. All of a sudden they call you telling you that Teams is running slow, their video is choppy, or what have you. There are a million different things that could be. It could be something in the user's own house. Maybe their home network is slow. Maybe their laptop that they're working from is running a game in the background or installing updates, or who knows what. There could also be a problem with that user's ISP. If they're connecting to your organization through a VPN, then maybe that VPN is busy or experiencing some performance issues. So there are so many things that can result in performance problems for a remote user. So it can be really tough to troubleshoot what's causing those types of performance issues. I am going to give you several things that you can look at, but one thing that I would quickly mention before I do that is that there are some really good third-party tools out there that can do root cause analysis for remote users who are having performance problems. I'm not necessarily going to recommend any one specific tool. I just want to mention that such tools do exist. So what types of things can you do when a user calls with performance problems? Well, the items on the list are really, really basic, so basic, in fact, that I almost felt guilty even including them in here. But these are some types of things that you can ask your user to try before you delve too deeply into the troubleshooting process. And the only reason why I included this particular slide is that sometimes it's difficult to think of like all of the troubleshooting items all at once. So a few things, you might ask the user to turn off anything that is hogging bandwidth. So for example, if the user is trying to have a Teams meeting and their kid is on a separate device in the next room streaming Netflix, well, that may be consuming too much bandwidth, causing that user to suffer from a poor Teams experience. You might also ask the user to reboot their router. I've seen that fix performance problems from time to time. Also, you may ask the user to move their wireless router to a better location. Just a few months ago, I was visiting a relative in another state, and they were having some performance issues, and come to find out they had their router in the garage, and it was underneath a metal beam, and it was causing some serious Wi-Fi signal problems throughout their home. Another thing is that they might look to see if there are too many devices that are connected at the moment, or if there's anything that's changed recently. Maybe they just added a new device last week and all of a sudden they started having performance problems. Well, then in a case like that, those performance problems are probably tied to that new device that they just added. Another thing that they might look at is whether there's any chance that somebody might be pirating their internet connection. Maybe they're using an outdated encryption protocol on their wireless router, or maybe they're not even encrypting anything at all. They've just got open Wi-Fi, and so their neighbors are sponging off of their internet connection. That's something else to consider. Of course, scanning for malware is another big one. I'm sure we've all seen situations in which malware causes performance problems. And then the last one is check for wiring. That seems like a really weird one to put on the list, I'll admit. But I once saw a situation where somebody was having a lot of problems with their Wi-Fi. And what the problem ultimately ended up being was that the cable that was coming in from the wall connecting to their wireless router, a pet had been chewing on, and so that cable quality had degraded, and there were a lot of retries that were occurring as a result, thereby resulting in diminished performance. So those are just a few things that you might ask your users to check if they're experiencing performance problems. So what else can you do? Well, when performance problems occur, one thing to keep in mind is that raw bandwidth isn't everything. Yes, the user needs to have a certain amount of bandwidth to have a good quality Teams experience, and I'll talk more about bandwidth in just a moment. But there are other problems that can occur. There might be problems with latency or jitter. Jitter essentially refers to when packets arrive at different speeds. So some packets are transmitted quickly, whereas others are slow. That can cause a lot of problems with Teams video. So one thing that you can do is to use the call quality dashboard that's built into Teams to get a sense of your user's experience. So if you've never seen the call quality dashboard, it's built into the Teams Admin Center. Here's a screen capture from it. And I'm not going to go too in-depth on the call quality dashboard because there's a lot that I want to get to. But one thing that I do want to show you is that there are all of these different metrics that you can use to quantify your user's experience. And the thing I like about this is that it's all color-coded. And the color codes indicate what the user experience is like. So for example, in the screen capture, the graph is blue, and if you look at the legend in the upper right corner, you can see that blue indicates a good experience, whereas red indicates a poor experience, and an orange circle that's colored white in the middle also indicates poor experiences. So besides the call quality dashboard, another thing that you can do is have the user to test their bandwidth. There are quite a few different sites on the internet that will allow a user to do that. Probably the best known one out there is something called Speedtest. So if the user goes out to Speedtest, it'll run a quick test and it will report what their bandwidth is in that moment. Now, doing this type of bandwidth test isn't 100%, simply because when you perform that bandwidth test, the end user's device is connecting to their ISP and is then connecting to the server that's used to perform that bandwidth test. Whereas if the user's having problems with Teams, their user's device is connecting to the ISP and then out to the Teams server. So the bandwidth test will help you gauge if there are performance problems, but it's not 100% accurate in that it doesn't measure what bandwidth is available to Teams. So one way that you can get around that problem is to use something called the Microsoft 365 Network Connectivity Test. And this is something that Microsoft provides free of charge. It's available on the Microsoft website at the URL that's shown on the slide. So what the user does is they go out to this URL, and then they either provide their location or tell Microsoft to figure out their location automatically, and then they run a speed test. And the speed test takes a couple of minutes to complete, and then when it completes, the user will receive a summary that looks something like this. So what the screen does is it shows what amount of bandwidth is necessary in order for the user to have a good experience, and it compares that to what the user actually has. So, for example, the first line, the test that's being run is media connectivity, so it's testing audio, video, and application sharing, and the result is no errors. The next test is testing for packet loss. And if you look at the results column, it's saying that the target is that there needs to be less than 1% packet loss over a span of 15 seconds. And the result was that there was no packet loss when I ran this test, indicating that I'm well within that threshold that Microsoft sets up. The next line looks at latency. The threshold is that the latency needs to be less than 100 milliseconds. And in my case, the latency was 26 milliseconds, so I am under that threshold for latency. And then the last test that's shown is for jitter. The target is less than 30 milliseconds, and in my case, the amount of jitter was 12 milliseconds. So again, I'm under the threshold for what Microsoft recommends having in order to experience good quality. So using this particular tool, this can help you to get a sense of where your users' problems lie with regard to their team's performance experience. So how much bandwidth is actually required in order to use Teams? Well, here's a breakdown provided by Microsoft, and I've got to tell you, the first time that I ever looked at this, I was a little bit surprised by just how low the bandwidth requirements actually were. Now, as you can see, the bandwidth requirements vary considerably based on what it is that the user is trying to do within Teams. So, for example, audio calling requires a lot less bandwidth than video calling, obviously. So for peer-to-peer audio calling, the user is going to have 30 kilobits per second bandwidth. 30 kilobits, that's almost nothing. So as I said, Teams requires very low bandwidth for most things. For peer-to-peer audio calling and screen sharing, that number goes up to 130 kilobits. Then for peer-to-peer quality video calling at 360p, which is lower than standard def television, by the way, that's 480p, at 30 frames per second, you need 500 kilobits. If you're stepping that up to low-grade HD quality, so 720p at 30 frames per second, the user is going to need 1.2 megabits per second. That number goes up to 1.5 megabits if you're going to bump that resolution up to 1080p. You'll need between 500 kilobits and 1 megabit per second for group video calling, and then 1 megabit to 2 megabits per second for high-def group video calling. So that's just a quick breakdown of the bandwidth requirements for using Microsoft Teams. So let's talk about a few observations from those bandwidth requirements. One thing to keep in mind is that there can be major differences between upload bandwidth and download bandwidth, as illustrated in the screen capture. So it's generally download bandwidth that matters. Another thing to keep in mind is that if there is a situation where there's insufficient bandwidth, Teams doesn't necessarily just deny service to you. What it will do is it will try to prioritize audio over video. So that's why you may have users who have a video calling session and the video is breaking up really bad, but the audio is fine. That's because Teams is trying to prioritize the audio in order to make the most of that limited bandwidth. So a few final thoughts about remote user performance. One thing that you might do if you sometimes have remote users who are experiencing performance problems is to give those users options for connecting. For example, you might give them the option of connecting voice only. Maybe there's a dial-in line they can use. And, of course, video calling if they've got plenty of bandwidth. Also, think about some things that you might be able to do on your end that will help to ensure good end-user performance. For example, if your users connect to a VPN, then you might consider doing a really hard assessment on that VPN and just make sure that it's up to the job, because you may have more users using it now than at the time that it was first installed. So you may find that you need to upgrade that to handle the greater capacity. And again, you might also consider providing your remote users with a list of simple things that they can do on their end to resolve performance issues. This goes back to that list that I presented on the earlier slide that covered things like turning off Netflix or moving the router and things like that. So the last area of conversation that I want to talk about is remote user engagement. And in some ways, this seems like a really weird thing to talk about, but one of the things that I've been hearing about over and over again is that with so many people returning to the office, those who are continuing to work remotely sometimes feel disconnected. What can happen sometimes is that you've got a whole conference room full of people, and there are a couple of people who are joined remotely, And because everybody else is there in person, they completely forget about the people that are on remotely. It doesn't happen in every situation, but it happens often enough that I wanted to at least bring it up in this presentation. So let's talk about some things that you might be able to do to help out your remote users and make them feel a bit more engaged. One thing is to consider your camera use policy. My recommendation is to encourage camera use, but don't necessarily require it. Because there may be any number of perfectly valid reasons why a user may not want to turn on their camera at a given time. Poor network performance, of course, would be a big reason. But also a tired, maybe the user woke up 10 minutes ago, they don't look their best, maybe they're not feeling well, something like that, and they just don't want to be on camera. Nothing wrong with that. Maybe there's a personal situation at home. The kids are running amok in the background, and they just don't want that to be a distraction for everyone. So again, just turn off the camera, no big deal. Or maybe the user's just shy and they don't like the way they look on camera. Another thing that you might be able to do to help your users to feel more engaged is to look for apps that can kind of take the place of some of the things that would normally be done in person. For example, during meetings, maybe there are brainstorming sessions or situations where a vote is normally taken with hand raising or a whiteboarding session. There are apps that can take the place of these in-person types of activities. And so if you've got the people that are working in person using those apps and you've also got the remote people using the same apps, that helps to put everybody on a level playing field so that the experience is consistent across the board and your remote users aren't getting left out. Another thing to think about is that introductions matter. Even if everybody knows each other, there's no reason you have to go into a great big long introduction, but just take a moment and go around the room and introduce everybody. And the reason why that's important is because it does serve as a subtle reminder that there are people who aren't attending in person, and it makes them less likely to be forgotten about. Another thing that you might consider is to adopt some basic rules for the meeting. Now, I had a former employer that took this one to the extreme, and if you look online, there are all kinds of top 10 lists, kind of like the one that is pasted on the right side of the screen. And these aren't recommendations from me, by the way. I'm not recommending that. But the idea is that there are some basic rules that you can adopt without going overboard that can help online meetings to be a bit more productive when you've got a mixture of in-person and remote users. So let's take a look at a few possibilities. Some possible rules are everybody keep their microphones off, unless there's a reason to keep them on. If you've got 3 or 4 people and they're casually talking among themselves, maybe there isn't a need to turn off microphones. So there can be exceptions to every rule. Another one, everybody identifies themselves when talking, because if you've got remote people and you've got in-person people, it can sometimes be difficult for the people who are there in person to know who it is that's speaking up remotely. And again, exceptions for every rule. If everybody knows each other really, really well and they recognize a voice immediately, then there's no need to do this. Another possible rule is avoiding side conversations, just because side conversations tend not to be heard by the people who are working remotely, so they don't really bring anything to the discussion for them. Small talk at the beginning, encourage that. And the reason why I say encourage that is because even though small talk at the beginning of a meeting seems unproductive, it can help to sort out any technical issues. Because if you're taking a few minutes and just letting everybody casually talk at the beginning, then chances are any technical issues that might exist are going to reveal themselves during that time, and that gives you a chance to get those issues sorted out before you really get into the important stuff. And then the last one, start and end on time. And then the very last thing that I want to talk about is to start exploring Microsoft Copilot as a best practice. I've worked with Microsoft products for a really, really long time, over 30 years now. And during that time, what I've found is that every so often, Microsoft will release something that is just completely groundbreaking. HoloLens comes to mind, and there have been a few other things like that over the years. Well, I think Copilot is going to be one of those things that really upends a lot of the Microsoft technology. It's extremely significant, and it's something that's going to be coming to Teams and to Microsoft 365 as a whole in the near future. So it's a good idea to go ahead and start familiarizing yourself with it, and to also bring it to your users' attention and get them used to the idea of using Copilot. So what is Copilot? Well, Copilot is a digital assistant that's based on OpenAI, which is the engine behind ChatGPT. But it's not just ChatGPT bolted onto Microsoft Office. It's an artificial intelligence engine that's designed specifically for Microsoft 365. And it can help you to perform various tasks within the Microsoft 365 apps, and that includes Teams. There is a demo that you can watch on YouTube that Microsoft recently presented about what Copilot can do for Office 365 users. And I don't really have time to get into everything that was done in that demo, but it was pretty incredible. If you have the time, I would highly recommend going out and looking for that and taking the time to watch it, because that demo did a really good job of showing some of the things that Copilot can do in applications like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on and so forth. But Copilot isn't limited to just those desktop apps, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. It's also being integrated into Teams and into some of the other Microsoft Office products. So let's take a few minutes here at the end and talk about what Copilot is and what it can do for you. Now, as I mentioned, Copilot is a virtual assistant. And Microsoft has had several virtual assistants that they've experimented with over the years. I told you at the beginning that I was going to talk about a particular application that seemed extremely unlikely for this presentation. Well, here it is, Microsoft Bob. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with Microsoft Bob, this came out in the mid-90s, and it was voted by several publications as one of the worst pieces of software ever created. I kid you not. What Microsoft was trying to achieve with Bob was they were trying to make computers easier to use for those who were new to computers. The idea being that instead of having to know how to operate Windows and how to launch an application, they would make the desktop a lot more relatable. So they turned the Windows desktop into a house. They called it the Bob House. And as you walk around this house, you could click on items that would correspond to the things that you wanted to do. For example, if you look in the lower left corner, you'll see a Rolodex. If you clicked on the Rolodex, that would open up your contacts. On the same table in the lower left corner, there's a bin with some letters in it. If you click on that, that would open your email. And there were a lot of things in the Bob House. Now, if you look in the lower right corner of the Microsoft Bob interface, you'll notice a dog with a speech bubble coming up. That was the virtual assistant within Microsoft Bob. It was the predecessor to Clippy, and it would try to provide help as you go along. Eventually, Bob ended up going away, and Microsoft brought Clippy to Office. And Clippy is one of those things that's also loathed by a lot of people. It can be just as annoying as the dog in Microsoft Bob. But Microsoft did improve things a little bit with Clippy and made Clippy arguably a bit more helpful than the dog in Microsoft Bob. But these are some of the things that Microsoft has tried in the past with regard to digital assistants. And I think that we can all agree that in spite of some limited successes, it just ultimately didn't work out all that well. Well, Copilot is different. Rather than having an animated cartoon character and prompts like, what would you like help with, get help writing a letter, just type the letter without help, that sort of thing, like what you see on the screen. Instead, Copilot has a bit of a cleaner interface. This is what Copilot looks like. And this is inside of Microsoft Word. So you can see that it's basically just a speech bubble asking you what you want to do. And in this case, somebody typed draft a proposal from yesterday's meeting notes, and they hyperlinked the meeting notes so that Copilot would know which ones to use. So there are any number of things you can do with Copilot. And I'm rapidly running out of time, so I don't really have time to get into a deep, detailed explanation of the types of things that you can do. But I do want to show you a few quick screen captures of some of the ways that Copilot can be used with Teams. So this was taken from the demo that I mentioned earlier that Microsoft recently did. So in this demo, somebody typed into Copilot, recap this meeting so far. So the idea being that somebody was late to a meeting, and they wanted to catch up on what had already taken place. So they asked Copilot to recap what had occurred so far. And Copilot provided a nice, neat summary of what's happened within the meeting up to this point. And you can see that summary is bullet pointed. So this is something super digestible that the user can read in less than a minute, and that would bring them up to speed on what's happened in the meeting that they've missed out on so far. And keep in mind, this is done in real time. So this is a meeting that's actually happening right now, and Copilot is able to summarize something that literally just occurred. So something else that Copilot can do is it can help those who have arrived late to a meeting to better understand the sentiment behind the topics that are being discussed. In this case, somebody typed into Copilot, how does the group feel about the inventory status? And then Copilot provided a short summary talking about its interpretation of how the different people who were involved in the meeting feel about this particular issue based on what's been discussed so far. So you'll notice it's not quoting anybody directly. It's actually deriving sentiment from various comments that have been made throughout the meeting. So very, very powerful software here. And then one last thing that I want to show you is toward the end of a meeting, somebody typed in, what questions are unresolved? Because let's face it, we've all sat in meetings where the meeting goes on and jumps from one topic to the next, and there are inevitably some things that end up getting left behind simply because of distraction. So Copilot can actually go out and say, oh, here's some things that you've talked about that are unresolved thus far that you might want to revisit. So Copilot can do some really amazing things within Teams, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. The point is, this isn't something that's available today, but it's something that will soon be available. So it's one of those things that you may want to begin familiarizing yourself with just because your users are bound to have questions, and it's something that you might want to begin slowly introducing to your users because this is something that can potentially really help them out with regard to using Teams. So with that said, I am out of time. I want to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Well, yeah, let's jump in with a couple of Copilot questions since we were just talking about that. Catherine wants to know, is Copilot accessible with a screen reader like JAWS?
Is Copilot accessible with a screen reader? What? I didn't catch that last part.
It sounds like JAWS is the name of a screen reader, but is it accessible with screen readers?
I don't really know for sure. My guess would be that it probably is, just because there's been such a big emphasis on accessibility. But having said that, Microsoft hasn't actually released Copilot yet, so there's limited information available right now. So it's really hard for me to know for sure.
Okay, Catherine also wants to know, do you know if Copilot will be available for Government Community Cloud?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. Again, it's in pre-release right now, so there may be some restrictions that haven't been publicized yet. But from what I've read, Copilot's going to be available across the entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem, so available to all the different subscription levels.
Great. Andrea chimes in with, can you delete or remove the built-in templates that do not apply to the company?
It's a good question. I've never tried. I suspect that you probably can. Easiest way to find out would just be to open up the Teams Admin Center and try it.
Can't have a Teams talk without a licensing question. Ahmed wants to know, I have an E3 subscription. Would I have access to Teams Admin Portal with the E3 subscription?
Yes, you do. As a matter of fact, the E3 subscription is what I'm using, and all of those screen captures that you saw of the Teams Admin Portal that was taken off of my system from an E3 subscription. So yes, you do have access to that. And I'll just add to that any Microsoft 365 subscription that includes access to Teams also gives you access to the Teams Admin Portal.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. How big of a role does my VPN play in remote users' performance?
It really kind of depends. Not every organization uses a VPN, and then some organizations, remote users will connect to Teams directly through Microsoft rather than connecting to the organization first. But if your users are connecting to the organization and then going out and connecting to Microsoft from there, then the VPN could play a huge role. So you do want to make sure that that's not becoming a bottleneck for your users.
Okay, Todd wants to know, what is the easiest way to restrict users from creating teams?
Easiest way to restrict users from creating teams is it just all comes down to permissions. If the user lacks the permission to create a team, then you don't have to worry about it.
Is there a way to try out Copilot and see what it can do?
Not yet. There are quite a few YouTube videos out there where you can really get a sense of some of the things that it can do. During the demo that Microsoft provided recently, they showed some personal use cases and some business use cases. So on the personal side, they showed Copilot being used to plan, I believe it was a graduation party. So they were doing everything from sending out invitations to building a guest list to creating a checklist of everything that needed to be done. And Copilot even created a OneNote notebook with separate tabs for all of the different tasks associated with planning this party. It went on and created a PowerPoint presentation and a speech to give at the party, and just all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And then Microsoft also did a demonstration on the business side where Copilot was analyzing an Excel document in real time and deriving meaning from business data within that spreadsheet. So there were some really incredible things that Copilot is capable of doing. My recommendation would just be to go out on YouTube, look for videos of Copilot, and then when Microsoft does open up the trials to more people, then you can obviously sign on to that and get some hands-on experience with Copilot.
Okay, it looks like we have one more Copilot question, and when can we expect Copilots?
I wish I knew. One other thing that I will add about Copilot is probably the coolest thing about Copilot, and something that nobody's really talking about, is that it makes it so that you don't have to actually know how to use the software anymore. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but think about the example that I gave a moment ago with somebody analyzing a complex Excel spreadsheet. Yes, you can do that natively in Excel. It's something you can do today, but you have to know how to use Excel to perform the necessary queries and things like that. With Copilot, you don't have to have any of that knowledge. You just tell Copilot what you're looking for, and it goes out and does the rest. So it's really going to transform the software in that it's going to eliminate any learning curve associated with the various Microsoft applications.
Okay, thanks so much, Brian. It looks like that's all the questions we have. Thanks for the great presentation.
Thanks for having me.